But with that being said, we got a lot to discuss and dive into. With that being said, let's get him in here. Anthony Treash of Pro Football Focus joins us as he does each and every single week. Anthony, what's going on, my friend? Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry being a couple minutes late. As soon as I hit the link on my laptop, it just crashed on me. So now I'm on my phone. So got to address that issue later on today. But yeah, I'm glad I'm here finally.
Dude, listen, you are feeling, I don't know what it is. I think it's just when you do this every single day, you run into more problems because I sit here on my end and I'm like, do people that do live shows and stuff, do they have these technical issues? But I guess when you're a one-man operation and you're just a guy and his MacBook and a microphone, sometimes some weird things happen, my guy. But hey, we press on either way. Again, man, I appreciate you taking the time. And Anthony, really excited to chat with you because seen a lot of you guys' numbers and statistics, and I'm sure that's something, I'm not really surprised because as these games go and the season goes, you have even more analytics and data, and then, of course, you get into conference play, and, the numbers start to become a little bit more relevant, I think, as you play conference games and get against kind of equal competition, if you will. So we'll start with this game, of course, on Saturday. Before we dive into the specifics and the numbers, Gamecocks dropped the matchup to Arkansas, 14 points. A little bit of a higher scoring game than I expected, but overall, I thought the game went how I thought it would in regards to, we both talked last week, did not love the matchup with Arkansas in the trenches. Your just overall thoughts, the 30,000-foot view on that game on Saturday, and were you surprised at all by how it played out?
Wasn't too surprised. I think I was a little, I would say slightly just surprised at how poorly Rattler played overall through the course of the game. It was very volatile. But, overall, the final score, the output, just the rushing that Arkansas was able to do, that success in that regard, it wasn't too surprising because, I agree with you. The matchup was, it was pretty rough for South Carolina. And also, too, I talked about the defense, what Arkansas maybe would throw their way. That was interesting. It was a mix of everything. It was constantly changing and evolving. They did just about anything they could. And it really disrupted both, the offensive line, just really everything in the offense. So, it wasn't too surprising, but, I thought we would see a little bit of growth within the offense just overall as a whole, even though it was a level up in competition.
Now, let's start first with that Gamecocks defense because it was from you guys this statistic came out, and I thought it just really spoke and it told the tale because I know, we want to get into Spencer Rattler, talk offense, and everybody loves talking offense. But where I thought the game was lost was obviously the run defense. You give up 295 yards rushing on the ground. I don't really care what your offense does. Unless you're playing a service academy and they've got 0 passing yards, you don't stand much of a chance to beat anybody when you give up damn near 300 yards rushing. But the stat that stood out, 21 broken tackles for Arkansas, 154 yards after contact. And those numbers, again, are via Pro Football Focus. I just really feel like, Anthony, that number, just that statistic alone, it really tells the tale of what we saw on Saturday.
Exactly. That's the story of the game. And I was actually doing some stuff the other day, just right after the game for another project behind the scenes here, and saw South Carolina, missed tackles numbers. It was near the bottom of the country. That you can't really, you can win with those types of numbers, but it's going to be pretty damn hard to get to, that final result that you want there. It's just kind of a number that's almost a liability in a sense. Is it going to happen every week? No. Again, you're talking about one of the most physical rushing attacks in college football with the way they play. It's not easy going up against those guys down there in Arkansas, but, at the end of the day, it's still kind of in that, it's teetering on that unacceptable range. So, it's something to monitor. Again, we talked about it last week too, when to click the, press the panic button on everything. It's not time to click the panic button yet. Again, we're still 2 games in, and it's a good point that you made. Data's just now starting to kind of come into form because you get a lot of outliers early in this time of year. And I think that's the biggest mistake a lot of people make is just, taking 1 or 2 game sample sizes and running away with it and thinking that's just going to be the story of the season. But, it's the story of the game, not necessarily the season yet. Give it a few more games there. So it's definitely something that, played a major part. I would say was probably the number one issue, as far as why Arkansas beat South Carolina, the way they did. So, it's definitely something to keep track of in the coming weeks. But yeah, it was about as bad as it could possibly get, just from a week 2 since South Carolina, it was down there with one of the worst in the country overall for the week.
Now, with that being said, Anthony, there were some standout individual performers. You look at Zach Pickens up front, 12 total tackles, half tackle for loss. Jordan Birch, 10 total tackles, a sack, and 2 tackles for loss. Unfortunately, again, you lose Jordan Strachan and Mo Kaba for the season. One guy we're really high on, Nick Eamon-Wari, in his first ever career start, 11 total tackles, had a quarterback hurry. Just talk about from the defensive side, again, while as a whole it was not a positive performance, I feel like there were probably some guys on you guys in that stood out as positive performers from the numbers side of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely positive performers, and really with this whole group, like when we talked about it in the preseason, was you don't see a well-rounded group yet, but you can see the possibility to get to that level, and at least getting some, signs that if everybody's kind of clicking and at the, I wouldn't say the peak of their form, but at least above, where they've been and taking that next step forward, then you start to kind of see some progress there. And, you mentioned Pickens and Mertz, like those guys were ones that were pegged as like, these are the guys that are going to take that step forward this year. They need to take that step forward. And I still think there's plenty of room to grow, but we're at least seeing, I would say, more consistent flashes and consistent play throughout. Now, it's not to say it's completely consistent, but whereas before it was just missing some games, but now we're starting to see it, I think, just a little bit more. And that's encouraging as you get into conference play. Not every team's going to be like Arkansas with the way they play stylistically. Arkansas is not the best team in the country, but they're just, they're a bad matchup for the way South Carolina plays. And so I do think it will get a little bit easier. It's not going to get any easier this upcoming week with Georgia, obviously. But, after that, even though it is some of the top competition in the country, I think they're better equipped to handle them. Especially if guys like Pickens and Birch specifically can kind of continue to take that next step forward there. So, all in all, it was a, overall, I would say a poor performance in certain areas, but like you said, you have those certain standout performers where, again, if everybody's clicking, then you can get a little bit more, encouraged about what could come. But yeah, unfortunately too, the injuries, I mean, those are kind of crushing a little bit. And now you just kind of have to make sure that the people replacing them are, not necessarily, they don't have to be great. They don't even have to be good. They just can't be an issue. And that's I think really the story of the South Carolina defense is I think you have enough of that star power there where as long as you have no issues, you're going to be fine defensively. And now it goes back to the offense and whether or not they can kind of produce at that elite level.
Yeah, I think the defense, Anthony, to your point, will have much more fun Saturdays than we saw. But that matchup specifically, it just, it was one we talked about a lot. And I just personally did not feel like it played in our favor very well. And certainly you saw that on Saturday afternoon. Let's move to the offensive side, Anthony, because you mentioned at the top of the show, Spencer Rattler did not play well in your eyes. 24 of 39, 376, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, a 54.6 QBR for folks that care about such things. But definitely early on, I think missed some game-changing deep balls that, again, certainly would have changed the complexion of the football game. I've got no issues with how Spencer Rattler played on Saturday. He wasn't that Heisman level great, but, there's 10 other guys around him. And he's also still dealing with a lack of a running game, 29 carries for 40 yards. Even if you take away the sack yardage, 29 carries, or 63 total yards rushing. Just give me your thoughts, your perspective on how you think he played. I mean, again, talking to some, and even the announcers were saying he's looking at the rush, right? He's still looking at the rush. The 1 interception that he had the guy open in the end zone for a second. Instead, his eyes are on the rush. He throws late. It's picked. What you saw from Rattler on Saturday, and again, it sounds like that you're still kind of left looking for more out of him after 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I'm telling, if people haven't heard me talk before, I'm one of the biggest Spencer Rattler supporters out there in the country that's not, in the South Carolina region. Definitely he had some mistakes, and you mentioned that 1 interception. And, you consistently saw that throughout the game. I think there's a lack of trust maybe up front, and understandably so. I mean, that offensive line is, if I'm not mistaken, the lowest graded from a pass protection perspective at the Power 5 level. And that just can't really hold there. Spencer Rattler is great when, performing outside the structure of the offense, but you can clearly see that they've been working on with him, trying to not do that, winning from the pocket. But sometimes, when you're in those situations, when you're in a muddy pocket there and, you have to worry about the rush and, you have a talented secondary there, you can get yourself into some issues. I think the biggest thing with him that, I would like to see him improve on is not just that, but just kind of, being a little bit more decisive, and that is kind of coincided with that, but also just have a better understanding of defender leverage. I mean, he had 2 good throws to Juice Wells, where, deep receptions towards the end of the game where, he did put it away from the defender, kind of threw the receiver open. But, over the course of the game, he had some mistakes there. I mean, there were a couple other interceptable balls thrown throughout there. But again, I think this all kind of comes back to, the offensive line and whether or not it can improve, because when you're, spending the amount of, dropbacks under pressure like he was, which I think it was around 20, it's going to be hard to kind of win that way. So, I think it's not just the way he performed. I think it was a group as a whole. And in the running game, not having success, and I think it goes along with the offensive line as well. But again, I still think, Seven's best play is ahead of him. We've seen enough from him to know what he can do. I think it's just about the situation as a whole getting better. And I think that one of the things that I want to see from, just the whole offense is just kind of taking some stress off the offensive line's shoulders, because we really didn't see that. Now, South Carolina was playing from behind for a good amount of that game, but you could still do, I think, a little bit better job, integrating more play action, more RPOs, just to help the offensive line out, because when they're in those obvious passing, those true, pure passing concepts, it's difficult, right? And especially when you're playing a talented defensive front like Arkansas's, they're going to get bullied and pushed around some a little bit. And so that's the thing when you look at this Georgia game upcoming, that's when I want to see changed a little bit. And, kind of adding more plays that are an extension of the run game, getting a little bit more creative, getting your guys in space. I think that's just kind of the whole thing there, because I think the way they played Arkansas was how you would play kind of, a group of 5 team or a lesser SEC opponent, but not necessarily a team that, that's as talented as they are on defense. So, I don't think it was all, I mentioned Spencer Rattler played poorly. I was a little disappointed in that, but I wouldn't say he shoulders all the blame there. I think it was kind of a group thing. And I think it was almost a trickle down effect as to, at the end of the day, because if you look at his PFF grade, it's not great. And the reason why, I think it's definitely, of course, some of it is his doing, but I think a great deal of it is just a trickle down effect from everything around him. And then kind of him putting him in really bad situations there. So I do think that he will turn it around, definitely. I said that last week. I'm still on the record. I do think he will turn it around. But in order for him to kind of maximize his full capabilities, everything else around him is going to have to get better, and that's not necessarily he can control.
Yeah. And Anthony, I want to make this point as well, because I don't know if maybe we have some new people tuned in, or I'm just seeing the comments. And I want to make the point, again, like you mentioned, you're obviously high on Spencer Rattler. You just have sky high expectations for him because you know what he's capable of. So I just want to throw that out there for anybody who's commenting or saying anything. Again, I don't think you come from a place of, trying to, God forbid, bring the kid down or anything, but you just, and you've seen and believe in the type of level that he can play at, that he's capable of playing at.
Oh, 100%. I mean, he is capable of being one of the best quarterbacks in college football. I genuinely think he can be that. And I still think by season's end, he can kind of turn the national media's eyes around and be like, okay, this guy is one of the best quarterbacks in college football. He's definitely has that kind of ceiling. So I do think that if you're just looking for good enough quarterback play, I mean, you're probably pleased with what he did. But again, I still think that he can be, he had too many of those jaw-dropping moments at Oklahoma to think that he can't do that at South Carolina. It's still in him. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. One guy I want to highlight, obviously, Anthony, before we move off this Arkansas game, moving to Georgia, Antoine Wells on the outside, 8 catches for 189 yards, a touchdown. He had that long one of 64 yards. Just talk about his game, how he graded out. And again, I know you and I mentioned him in the preseason, the transfer from James Madison. He certainly looked to be as good as advertised on Saturday afternoon.
100%. I mentioned last week that the biggest thing that I learned from the Georgia State game was that he's going to be the guy in this offense. And then he verified that against Arkansas. I mean, he's going to be the go-to guy. And I think that's what makes me excited about what this offense can be, because right now it's just him. But if you get these guys healthy, if you can get Stogner back to where he was, and that's still an if, but if you can get Van, you can get Rucker out there, you're looking at a really good group. And Jaheim Bell, of course. So that's where I get really excited about what this offense can be. But right now, Juice Wells is definitely performing like he really is one of the most productive receivers in college football. Like you said, just the receptions there. I mean, you look at his yards per route run, which is a great measure here at PFF. The measures per route production. I mean, I think it's over 4.3, which again, it's 2 games. We still need to see more, but that's a pretty decent number for his first 2 games at the Power 5 level, coming from a previous FCS level school in James Madison. He's just an all-around type. He's definitely that downfield threat there. And I think, what he can do, just kind of the adjustment to the balls downfield, like we saw against Arkansas, I think that's a huge thing. And I think as him and, number 7 continue to build that relationship, build that trust out there on the field, these guys can really explode. And we're already seeing some pretty good play out of the two just in that connection alone. So I definitely think that, we've seen great from Juice Wells, and I think we're only going to see better from him. So, he's definitely, a sneaky name out there where obviously we know who he is. South Carolina fans know who he is, but the national media still may not know who he is, but I think they will here pretty soon.
Anthony, let's move to the game this weekend. Let's talk the Georgia Bulldogs. Do they have a weakness? I mean, I haven't seen the grades or anything, but when you look at their first 2 weeks of the season, you beat Oregon 49-3 after a lot of folks spent the preseason saying, well, Georgia lost a lot from last year. They're not going to be as good as they were. Yeah, right. They're ranked number 1 in the country in defense yet again. Stetson Bennett is playing the best football of his entire life. He's thrown for over 300 yards in the first 2 games. They're loaded across the board. When you look at Georgia, what do the numbers say? How do they grade? I mean, again, I have to imagine the number 1 team in the country, their numbers are just jaw-dropping across the board, if you will.
Yeah, it's really hard to find a weakness just through the first 2 weeks. I think the biggest thing with this group is just the confidence. If they didn't lose it, it's still there like it was last year. And the fact that they have like 5 stars coming in, young players that have never played. It's just, it's astonishing at the level that they're performing. Again, it's 2 games. We need to see more from them. But, Malachi Starks, the true freshman defensive back, what he did against Oregon, that was phenomenal stuff. And, I really do think that this defense, again, I want to see more, but it's hard imagining that they're going to be much worse than one of the, a top 5 group nationwide. So pieces are definitely there. I still think that there are vulnerabilities to expose because, well, Stetson Bennett's been great. I think we've still seen enough from him to know that if they do get down a little bit, and I think Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator there, is probably one of the more underappreciated assistants in the country. He has a wealth of experience. He's a well-known person, but what he's doing with what he has with that offense is, against Oregon 49-3. It's ridiculous. So I do think that, Stetson Bennett, I'm not going to say he's a complete byproduct of the system he's in. He is playing confident like everybody else on that team. But I do think that, when the situation gets a little bit more difficult and he has to do a little bit more, more's put on his plate, that's when that offense can falter a little bit. And I think that's when it gets interesting. So I don't know if anyone's going to beat him in the regular season. But, I do think I could see a scenario where if they do lose, it's not going to be anyone's fault. Maybe it's Stetson Bennett's fault. It's just a very well-rounded group. Once again, it's just, you don't have necessarily that quarterback that you can count on a week-to-week basis. But again, he's playing phenomenal so far. We can see if he can keep making these sharp decisions, take good care of the football. And if that's the case, then it's going to be tough to beat him.
It's up to Clayton White, Anthony, to combat or to devise a game plan to slow down that Georgia offense. How do you think the Gamecocks should attack them? Again, it's a Herculean task, if you will. What's interesting in these first 3 weeks for South Carolina, and maybe we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, but I felt like this season almost has built on itself in the sense of Georgia State did something. Then Arkansas just did more of what Georgia State did, but way, 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 way better. And now Georgia is like, they are the best that you've seen thus far, but you gave up 200 yards rushing in week 1, 295 in week 2. I don't have a lot of confidence coming in this when you're going to slow down the Georgia rushing attack. And now you face a Georgia offense that, again, like you mentioned, has so many weapons and so many options. What can South Carolina do to slow down the Georgia attack and, lack of a better way of putting it, keep themselves in the football game?
Yeah, it's going to be tough because you need to slow down the run game. And just like you mentioned, like what we've seen so far, there's plenty of reason to believe that's just not going to happen. And that's when it gets concerning because if you get more guys up to the line of scrimmage, they're going to beat you because Tom Monken's going to bring in that heavy personnel. South Carolina's going to suck in that defense. And the next thing you know, you got a play action, 30-yard bomb down the middle there, and free guy running in space, touchdown. They did that continuously last year. The biggest thing is, first of all, you got to stop the run. You need to get them into third and long situations. And at that point, when you're in those obvious passing situations, Stetson Bennett really struggles when you have, I would say, diverse pressure packages, right? If you bring those linebackers, mug them at the line of scrimmage, and then bring some simulated pressures and creepers in there, it really throws him off. That's when the pass rush really, falters him a lot. And then I think that's when you can kind of get him into making mistakes and turnovers. You look at the SEC championship game last year. That's a prime example of that. Alabama did a fantastic job in those situations. Obviously he got his revenge in the national title game, but he did show multiple times throughout the season that if he needs to win in those situations, it's a little bit more difficult, and the defense can kind of take advantage of that. And it's just, for South Carolina, it's just about getting into those situations. I think they can do the last part, but it's just the beginning. Stopping the run. Just being heady for some of the, I would say, eye candy that they are going to throw their way. Of course, when you have a diverse, or dynamic weapon like Brock Bowers, it can be a little bit difficult there. So they definitely have the pieces there. But stopping the run is probably the number one thing they got to do. And if they do that, then I'm not going to say that they're going to completely shut down the offense, but they're going to make it at least interesting. And I think you could possibly force Stetson into a turnover or two. And at that point, it could be, maybe it'll win the game, but they make it a little bit closer than it should. So, there's definitely ways to stop Georgia's offense. Unfortunately for South Carolina, it's just evolving around getting the run game and kind of controlling that. And what we've seen so far, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to do that. So I think it's an interesting game. I wouldn't completely just say it's a done deal. It's Bo's. Georgia's going to win by 30. I wouldn't say that. But South Carolina's going to have to overcome a lot in order to get, relatively close to beating them at the end of the day.
Yeah, Anthony, this is a football team offensively looking to find its identity, and not really the best opponent to do that against. I wouldn't say Georgia's the best opponent to try to find yourself against, but when you look at this offense and going into this football game, I'll ask you kind of the same question on the flip side. How do you think the Gamecocks offense should attack Georgia? I feel like, listen, you can't run the football. I don't think, like you mentioned, this is the week you figure it out on the run game. All of a sudden, you're pushing Georgia around when you ain't pushing anybody else around. Spread them out. Let Spencer Rattler throw. This is a Georgia defense, by the way, just 3 sacks on the season. So an offensive line that was better pass blocking a little bit last week, a little bit. Maybe Spencer Rattler can have some success. Just talk about that offense, how you think they should attack Georgia, and what you're looking for from Spencer Rattler, because, again, this is a big game for him.
Yeah, I mean, this Georgia defense, even though they lost a lot of talent, it's still one of the best coached group. And mainly when I say that, it's because of Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann being the co-defensive coordinator there alongside your pal. But, I do think that it's going to be hard to run on these guys just because they're so well coached. I mean, they're just technically sound, right? And, if you watch any clips of their practices or, any of the coaching clinics, you can understand why. It's just almost robotic, the movements that they make, and it's hard to stop when you have these just physically gifted freaks there. So it's going to be hard to run on them. I think from a passing perspective, I mentioned it earlier, you need to see just a little bit more creativity, I think, from a play calling perspective. That's what you're going to have to do against these talented teams. And I think just in general, that's just something South Carolina needs to do just to kind of mask that issue up front with the offensive line. You mentioned the sack number. I think that's kind of interesting. But I look at some of the guys on the Georgia defensive line, like Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith. Those guys could have a field day if South Carolina has the same offensive game plan as they did against Arkansas, right? Even though if they do get down a little bit early, it's not just in that panic mode. I think you could still just kind of have room to, try to throw some stuff their way. I think they're going to have to. It's just going to have to be a little bit of luck too on maybe some trick plays. But I think you have to throw some play action shots in there. I think you need to increase the motion. You need to bring more RPOs to the table. Just make it a little bit easier to complete passes. Maybe it could be a little dink and dunk style, and then you hit them over the top. But you need to be more creative, right? And I think that's just the key there. You're not going to beat this Georgia team from a talent perspective, but maybe you can, I wouldn't say out-coach them, but, just out-call plays better than them, right? Just kind of throw some stuff that they're not expecting there. So, I think that's just kind of the key there. A little bit of luck could go a long way for them, but definitely just be a little bit more creative than what they have been.
Yeah, Anthony, on a final note, I think back to 2019, and you talk about some luck fall your way, a couple of interceptions, a pick six, some good fortune, and maybe that's the recipe for what would arguably be the upset of the year in college football. The Gamecocks are able to take down Georgia. Anthony Treash of Pro Football Focus. Be sure to check out his work. Anthony, it's always a pleasure to chat with you, my friend. Looking forward to doing it again next week.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, man. Appreciate it.